Dr. Hannah, who is going to be presenting on work around youth and the politics of refusing low-wage employment. And I think it sort of feeds into what we talked about in last week's presentation on informality. Dr. Hannah has done a lot of work around youth and other areas that are also related to informality. So today, Dr. Hannah is going to be talking about the study that she carried out in Zanspret around youth and the politics of refusing to accept low-wage employment. So let me give this opportunity to Dr. Hannah to start the presentation.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be able to speak with your students, also in the beginning of your research journeys, which is always, very daunting, but also very exciting. If you get the research bite, if it bites you or you bite it, it's kind of it becomes a lifelong career of research and a curiosity about the social world and how it works. So thanks very much for the invitation, and also thanks especially to all of the students who are here. And I did prepare a few slides, but they're only photos, and because of my setup with my computer today, I can't actually see my own notes and the slides. So I'm not going to show the photos now, but I could do at the end if there's the time. But I thought I was working with the assumption many of you have read the paper. So I wanted to just begin by saying how I came to write this paper. And so kind of empirically, where did this paper begin? From the research in Zanspret? And then theoretically, what were the debates in the literature that this paper was also trying to speak to or to answer? I'm going to say less about Zanspret in my formal presentation, about the history of Zanspret, about its location on the outskirts of Johannesburg, about my research in Zanspret. I've been doing research in Zanspret since 2011, so more than 10 years now, and it started with a focus on protests and youth political action outside of formal kind of electoral politics. And then I became much more interested in questions of work, unemployment, how the economy actually works. But in the questions, if you want to ask me about Zanspret, about actually how I went about doing my research, of course, I'm very happy to take all of those questions, but I'm going to focus more on the kind of contribution and the argument and how I make that argument in the paper. But I look forward to all your questions. So maybe we didn't actually say how long I have, but is it like 10, 15 minutes fine to speak for?
No. You actually have, we can give you up to 30 minutes if you want to go to, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so you have a lot of time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll take a bit longer, but also I'm very happy for an engagement back and forth. So, okay, so I think I wanted to start by saying that this, like I guess all research, but this paper in particular, it's in a way a product of 10 years of research. But specifically from my PhD research, which I was doing in 2015-16. But the real question that this paper is trying to ask, which is, why do some, at least young Black South African men in this particular place, reject or turn down certain types of low-wage jobs? And I think when I first came to Zanspret in 2011, so much of the conversation in the public debate kind of conflates high levels of unemployment in South Africa with political unrest, with frustrations in society, which can lead to social unrest. And I, back as a master's student, like many of you, was trying to really unpick, to ask actually what is the relationship, if anything, between unemployment and political action. And the more research I did in Zanspret, the more it became much more complicated, that while the national picture is that there is very, very high levels of unemployment, in this particular place called Zandspruit, which is in the kind of northwestern corner of Johannesburg, is actually a place compared to other parts of Johannesburg and other parts of the country has more work opportunities than others. And this is evident in the fact that informal settlements like Zandspruit and Diepsloot, which are surrounded by these new developments in Johannesburg, which you see golf estates, you see these new fancy complexes being built, you see lots of the service sector industry locating itself in these areas. And in a way, people are moving to those areas who are trying to enter the formal labor market. So compared to many other parts of South Africa, you could argue that Zandspruit has more formal waged work opportunities than elsewhere. And that I was meeting people in Zandspruit, in particular young South African men, who had done often various types of jobs in the past. And when I would ask questions about why someone had had a job and then lost a job, in some cases it was because there was a short-term contract and someone had, only been employed for 3 months, and therefore they'd lost the job because of that, because it was, a very precarious short-term contract. But in a surprising number of cases, when I started doing, especially work histories, so doing long interviews with the same people and asking about their work histories over a 5 or a 10-year period, it became very clear that there were a number of instances when someone had received a job and then lost that job because they had chosen to just not rock up to work the next day, or there had been some altercation at the workplace. And so I guess I became kind of very interested in this question around the refusal of work. Of course, it was only certain types of jobs that were being rejected, not all jobs, because it makes us have to think about questions around employment and youth unemployment in a slightly more complicated way, because the dominant narrative is high levels of unemployment is a bad thing, it's a problem. And so the solution is jobs. In a sense, any job is better than no job. And the research I began doing some years ago and have continued to do has shown that the reality in a place like Zandspruit is much, much more complicated. One, we often don't talk enough about the quality of jobs in the youth unemployment discussion, in the political sphere or in the policy sphere. And so it became clear that at least for some young men, any job is not better than no job. And so I was interested in that. And then the other thing that became very interesting to me was around this question of what I often call the dynamics of incorporation. So who does what in the economy and why? And why does one person have the ability to refuse, the worst job available, which might be a day laboring job that you pick up on the side of the road, which is, in waste removal or construction, that pays, a few $100 if you're lucky. Whereas someone else, a migrant, more recent migrant, for example, might jump at that job as the best option available to them in one moment. So I was interested in these dynamics of incorporation and the intersections between who does what in the so-called formal labor market, in the sense of people who go to work outside of Zandspruit. And then I was also really interested in the dynamics of who does what inside of Zandspruit. So who can make money in so the fact that you had a seminar last week on the informal economy is of course very related to the questions. So one can only often refuse to do a certain type of job if one has access to other kinds of income, be that through the informal economy, be that through family and friends or the social welfare system or some other means. So this paper stems from me acquiring these insights from in-depth, long work history interviews, and often knowing some of the men I refer to in this paper, men like Cabello, Sizwe, Twanelo, some of whom I've also now known for many, many years, and also getting to know them as they've made decisions often to enter and exit the labor market, sometimes because, like I said, they lost that job because there was it was only a 2-month contract or something, but in a number of cases, leaving because of something that had happened in the workplace. So, so these were the kind of empirical questions I was trying to understand. Why is any job not better than no job? And what actually shapes who does what in the economy? And those are the questions that were kind of underpinning, you could say, this paper, which eventually became called Living, Not Just Surviving, The Politics of Refusing Low-Wage Work. And then the debates in the theoretical literature or the scholarly literature that I was very interested in here. The one was, and I've got these two slides, there's one slide that has the two books I refer to. So the one is a book by a historian called Clive Glazer, who wrote a book on the gangs in Soweto in the 1970s, which were predominantly young men, as well as a book by Wilson and Archie Mafeje, which is set in Langa, which is a township in Cape Town. And in both of these books, which have a very, especially the one by Wilson and Mafeje, have a very kind of use ethnographic methods. What appears in both of these books, which are looking at the kind of 1950s to 1970s period under really the height of apartheid, show very clearly that this idea of young men refusing to do the worst types of jobs available in the formal sector is not a new thing, that there's actually a long history of employers preferring to hire rural migrants or migrants from other countries who are in the city more temporarily, and that in many ways low-waged work was seen as the worst option, with more lucrative means being available often in the informal economy. So I was interested, as soon as I started reading these historical ethnographies, that piqued my interest even more to think about what is actually happening when a job is being refused, and what does that mean for how we think about the role of waged labor in South African society and in the policy debates around youth unemployment. But equally, what does that mean for how we think about the labor movement, worker resistance, in which so much of the literature, because of the very key role that the trade unions played in the liberation struggle, and the ways in which the labor struggle or workers' struggle kind of merged with the liberation struggle, merged with community struggles especially in the 80s. That so much of the conversation in the South African context, but also globally, around worker resistance focuses on trade unions, which of course is focusing on, in the South African economy currently, is often looking at the more protected workers and not the lowest earning workers, especially in the service sector. So most of the jobs that are available to someone that moves to Zandspruit are jobs in sectors like private security, contract cleaning jobs, working in Gulf estates or private homes as domestic workers, or in a kind of as a landscaper or a gardener. So these are all the sectors of employment where we know from other research that unions are either absent entirely or only very marginally have a presence. So this paper was, on the one hand, trying to answer these empirical questions. You know, why do young men refuse low-wage jobs? What actually shapes that decision? Why are some people able to refuse low-wage jobs and not others? And then how do we make sense of the politics of this refusal of low-wage jobs, especially when unemployment rates are extremely high? So under apartheid, in the period where these books are written, this is at a time when labor is in high demand. There's not the surplus labor that we currently have in the South African economy. And also the refusal of work then is also tied up with resisting apartheid and racial domination in a very specific form, prior to the democratic transition. So what does it mean to refuse a job? And what does that mean for how we understand wage work, but also what does that mean for how we think about worker resistance and the centrality of waged work? So those are really the kind of, I hope that became clear as you read the paper. Those were the kind of big questions I was grappling with as I was writing this paper. And I'm now just going to talk about a few of the key findings that I unpack in the paper. I'm just going to have a quick sip. Hold on. Okay, so I thought what I would now do, also knowing that I have more than 10 minutes, I thought I maybe only just had a few moments to sketch out the broad kind of objective of the paper. So I will say a little bit about so really what the paper does is it sets it up, I think, in terms of these bigger debates and this broader history. And then the real kind of empirical contribution that comes from these primarily in-depth interviews, often multiple interviews with people I've known a fairly long period of time, is I unpack, what are the three main reasons. Well, what I distilled from all of these conversations and interviews were three primary reasons why young men refuse low-wage jobs. And those three primary reasons are what I often refer to as the impossibility of meaningful progress or mobility in low-wage jobs. So that first set of factors is really tied to the expectations of work. What, in this case, young South African men expect a job to provide one with. Then the second kind of key set of reasons is less about the expectations of work and more about the experiences of actually being in a particular workplace. And here I emphasize the racial inequalities and the racial antagonisms of the present day workplace. For many black young South African men, especially in this region of Johannesburg. So there is a particularity to the area I'm writing about. And then the third set of factors, which I call the social demands that come with having a wage job. And this could also be described in shorthand as the kind of conversation around black tax, and that while one wants a job, as soon as one has access to a job, it comes with huge social obligations and burdens. So I'll just say a few things about those three factors, and maybe just give one kind of quote that's in the text. So the first reason in the paper, I call it a waste of time, low wages, and the impossibility of meaningful mobility. And definitely in the survey, I also did a survey with 100 young people, and both in the survey and also in these work history interviews, it was very clear that the main reason someone left a job was either because the wages were simply too low, especially when one considers the cost of getting to work, the transportation costs, etc., but also what were described as simply put, exploitative labor conditions. So, people working without contracts, not getting paid, having uniforms deducted off their wages, all sorts of exploitative practices that would just seem to be especially commonplace. But what I tried to show in the paper is that the reason someone like Kabelo, for example, quits a job is not just because of low pay or just because of exploitation of one kind or another. That really the underlying reason seemed to always come down to the fact that the jobs that were often available in the surrounding industrial areas and shopping malls could never really allow for any social mobility, so to improve one's own situation or the situation of one's family. And I think I say in the paper that a job is evaluated, is a job worth taking or not? That a job was not seen as worth taking if it just provided basic sustenance. Rather, a job was seen to be evaluated on its ability to provide adequately for yourself, but also for, importantly, your family and your other dependents. And so if I had my slides up, I had a quote from Cabello, who quit a retail job that paid him on a commission-based contract without any guaranteed minimum pay. And he often described this job to me as a waste of time because it didn't pay him enough to move out of his mother's shack or send his children to university. So he lived with his mom and his sister's 2 children in a very kind of cramped condition. And so when I asked why he decided to leave this job, he responded, and this is a quote directly from Cabello. He said, "You don't just want to work and waste your life. You want to work and see the benefits of working. If I'm not going to get an opportunity to get a house from that job, what's the point in me sticking to that job if it's not going to help me get a secure roof over my head?" So here in this part of the paper, I'm really trying to make this point that a job is not evaluated on the ability to provide basic sustenance, but really to fulfill certain expectations of respectable manhood. So, and of course, there's lots of literature on this, in the ways in which dominant ideas around men as breadwinners, men, respectable manhood being tied up with starting a family, building a home of one's own. So despite unemployment rates, just increasing year on year, and despite the type of jobs that are available are increasingly very precarious, the expectation that a job should still allow men to kind of take on the breadwinner role or expectations, that hasn't shifted, which of course the frustrations that this produces are apparent in our society in lots and lots of different ways. So as I said, the first set of reasons are very much tied to young men's expectations of jobs themselves, whereas the second set of reasons, which in the paper I call, I think, I'm just looking at it, printed it out for myself again, under white people, racial inequalities and antagonisms, this set of factors, the second set of reasons, these are tied much more to the experience inside of these jobs, the everyday experience of being inside of them. Sorry, I've had a scratchy throat all week, so I hope you can hear me fine. So the experience of racial inequalities and discrimination in the workplace was another key factor that underpinned young men's decision to quit jobs. The workplace was not only a site of racial abuse, exploitation, and humiliation, but was also the site where young men came face to face with South Africa's stark and still racialized inequalities. So, as you kind of heard in the introduction, I've also done a lot of work on youth unemployment and also worked with some people working more in the policy sphere. And often employment is described always as a net good, i.e., employment equals inclusion. But a lot of what my research also showed that while that might be true in one sense, that once you actually are working in the checkers serving not just a middle class clientele, but often in some of these shopping malls in the surrounding area, a very upwardly mobile social class, that actually being inside a job in some of these service sectors is where you come face to face with just how unequal South Africa is, or just how excluded you are, in a sense, from some of these aspirational modes of consumption. And that was very much the sense I got from a number of my interlocutors in Zanzibar, in many of our conversations back and forth. So in this section of the paper, I provide quite a lot of quotations that come from a series of conversations I had with someone that I call Twanelo. And he recounted his reason for leaving a job at a plastic factory, which is quite close to where Zanzibar is, in an area called Kaya Sands. And these are his words. He said, "I worked my butt off for those 3 years," he said, visibly embittered. "I don't know how much I brought into that company, but I brought a lot of money." So his experience working for this company had brought him to the conclusion that, and here I'm quoting him again, that white bosses use Black people to make them rich without caring about their well-being. They, here referring to white people in general, but his white boss in particular, want to keep Blacks at the bottom of the ladder and whites at the top, he insisted. Tonelo asserted that he would not stay in a job that makes someone else rich when he was not given an opportunity to progress. He said, "I don't believe I need to slave for someone else," he told me. "If I'm working for someone, Black or white, when I see I'm being exploited, I move on. I take what's mine and I move on." So I think in many ways, Tonelo's words speak for themselves. And of course, are speaking for the experiences of many, many others that I interviewed and got to know and do know still in Zandspruit, but also I think many other places. But in other narratives and interviews and conversations, young men often also drew attention to the disparities in wealth and the lifestyles of their bosses and those and their fellow workers. And I think in the paper, I discuss an example from a conversation with Tebogo, who worked in a large supermarket as a merchandiser, and he contrasts his manager sitting at the Mug and Bean opposite the Pick and Pay, sitting on his laptop, apparently working so hard, but when Tebogo's comparing his own experience of being on the shop floor for 8 to 12 hours a day. In a way, as I was saying earlier, instead of the workplace being a site of inclusion, it becomes very much the ways in which Tebogo, but also others, begin to articulate a critique of South Africa's inequalities. So I think two things emerge from the perspective of my interlocutors. One, being included in the labor market can lead to a sense not of economic inclusion and possibility, but rather exclusion, and of being trapped at the bottom of the social ladder. And I think the other is that race relations and racial hierarchies and racism perhaps still irretrievably taint the formal labor market. And this, if you read these older ethnographic accounts by Clive Glazer and Archie Mafeja and others, you see this exact same narrative occurs in the interviews that were done, as early as the 50s, 60s. And then finally, I see I'm definitely using up my 30 minutes. The final set of factors, the third kind of grouping of reasons, I title, "It's a lot of pressure, the social burden of waged work." And here what I'm trying to unpack is what I spoke about at the beginning. It's the ways in which the social obligations that men in particular have to their families and their children shape their economic decisions, shape what work is worth doing or not doing. And this is probably the most complicated set of factors of the three. So on the one hand, I think I hope it's clear, you can let me know if it's not, that on the one hand, for many young men I got to know and do know in Zandspruit, needing to provide for one's family is a motivating factor. It's what motivates young men to take up or keep a job, even if it's a job that they don't like very much. So I've written elsewhere about how men negotiate their obligations as fathers and how this intersects. And, I know someone that worked as a petrol attendant for 6 or 7, 8 years and very much stayed in that job primarily because of his obligations to his son. But there were also many instances in my research and in these work history interviews where sometimes it was these same very social obligations that were the reason that led someone to quit a job, or at least think twice about it. Is it really worth it to earn 3,000 Rand when I'm going to have X amount deducted from transport, and then that very job is going to come with all this stress and pressure to provide for others? And I think this is captured best by a quote that I include right at the end by someone I call Mandla. And he says, these are his words. He says, "Having a job, especially for men, carries a big weight, a big burden. But when you're hustling, here referring to more diverse in so-called informal types of accessing resources. But when you're hustling, there's no fixed time when people will know I have X amount of money in my bank account. But he continued, if you have a job, even the extended family, they will know at the end of the month, Mandla is going to get paid. But when you're hustling, there isn't really a plan to say, hey, listen, you've got money. So this is something I've also written about in other domains, that so in a way, the predictability of a wage is the thing that I think many of us want, and those with the privilege of having a regular wage job want. But on the other hand, if you have extensive social obligations, there can be a freedom that is experienced in it not being obvious to everyone in your social community or network that you earn X amount of money in it and you receive it on the 25th. And so I'm trying to kind of capture how social obligations intersect with young men's economic decision making in really, really complex ways. So those are the three sets of reasons. I hope at least I've captured some of the essence of them. Of course, there's much more detail in the paper. And then maybe I'll just conclude with a few closing thoughts on the kind of politics of refusing work. And so I guess the question, as I said in the beginning, is how are we to understand and conceptualize the voluntary exiting or withdrawing from low-wage jobs in a time of mass unemployment, and where avenues for protest, such as unions and strikes, are few and far between, especially for workers in the types of jobs available. So if I'd had my slides, I had some slides from 2012, where we saw an explosive strike wave, both in mining and the agricultural sectors, where strikers at the Marikana mine were demanding 12.5. But I think these more, what I call in this paper, more hidden or covert forms of resistance to waged work, such as voluntarily quitting a job, just deciding to not turn up tomorrow, or the withdrawal from waged work entirely, have received much less scholarly attention. And I think one of the reasons for this, which I talk about in the paper, is I quote Franco Barchesi, who speaks about how historically the refusal of low-waged work was dismissed by especially left Marxist scholars, and most of the best labor scholars in South Africa very much come from a strong Marxist tradition. Precisely because, so they ignored or overlooked these forms of resistance precisely because of as Barchesi writes it, he says, because of the left's symbolic investment as waged labor and production as the basis of development and progress. So in a sense, waged labor was seen as the basis of social struggle and social change. And so resisting work was kind of ignored in these analyses, hence the emphasis on the formal trade union movement, in a sense to the exclusion of thinking about the withdrawal of labor in the form that's in some of these older ethnographic accounts. And so I argue in the paper that voluntarily quitting is a way to signal discontent with a labor market where employment is not a counterpoint to precariousness. In a sense, most jobs in the South African labor market do not provide an escape from poverty or the kind of social mobility that most people and most residents of Zandspruit desire. But I argue that while urban young men's refusal of low-wage jobs, I think, can be read as a protest against marginalization and especially racialized inequality, I show that I don't think it's only about resistance. It's not only about saying no to something or saying that, the types of waged work available are not the types of jobs we want or that we envisioned being the jobs that we would do in post-apartheid South Africa. That actually refusing a low-wage job is also precisely an aspiration and a political demand for social inclusion. It's for different terms of incorporation. It's actually a demand tied to the aspiration to live and not survive, which I try to capture in the title of the paper, but also for a South African economy in which the benefits of the South African economy are distributed much more equally. And so in the end of the paper, I unpack this kind of refusal as involving a political demand and show how that is present in the ways in which citizenship and a discourse of rights were articulated in young men's explanations for why they quit a job or what type of job they would like, and discuss that in relation to how the rejection of certain low-wage jobs is closely tied up with a kind of shared disdain towards foreign immigrants who are seen to not just necessarily take low-wage jobs, but are seen to kind of undercut the labor markets altogether. So this might be something we want to pick up in the discussion, but I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for that interesting presentation. I think we can open it up and probably start with the students, and then after that we can open up to everyone else who is in the meeting. So, any comments, any questions from the students first? Yes, I see Obakeng and Kumo in that order.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Doc and colleagues. Thank you very much for a great paper, Doc. And I think for me, it has brought a lot of light in terms of the concept of South Africans are choosy when it comes to employment and all of that. I think it dispels the stereotypes and also the myth that we South Africans don't want to seek employment. But I have I think two questions. The first question will be on the concept that you have developed in your paper, that is the youth not or resigning from their employment. It's a form of resistance to the exploitative and the unjust system of employment that we have. I just wanted to pick your thoughts on the fatalism associated with the oppressed, Paulo Freire. Don't you think perhaps because of the socio-economic situation of, or the precarious position that the youth find themselves in, isn't it perhaps a fatalistic posture or position that they have taken instead of a resistance approach that you have indicated in your paper? I think perhaps we could look at it from that vantage point, that is a fatalistic action by the youth. And then lastly, the question of positionality, as a English white speaking white woman doing work with a male, predominantly Black youth. What were the challenges when you were conducting this research, and added to that in the township? Thank you very much, Doc.
Yeah, thank you. Those are brilliant, both of them brilliant questions.
Yeah.
Should we take both? And then I respond.
I think we can take Kumo as well, and then you can respond, and then the other ones will prepare their questions as well. Kumo, go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'd first like to say thank you for the presentation. When I was reading your paper, in the beginning especially, I realized that I always had the opinion that people who tend to let go of jobs just because it pays low, have an element of entitlement. But as I read, I feel like I understand now why it is that they would rather let go of low-paying jobs. And then that brings about my question where I ask you, what personal opinions did you have as a researcher when you went into the field that quickly dissolved after you had conducted your research?
Yeah, great. Also really good, really great questions. Okay, I'm hoping there's going to be lots more, so I'm going to try and answer as quickly as I can, although they're all quite big questions. So maybe just first, Oberking, yes, I think, this is a really worthwhile line of inquiry, but it's one around, is this resistance or is it fatalism? And of course, this is also the debates, which reading between the lines, it sounds like you're maybe are reading the debates around Afro-pessimism. And yes, I think you could take some of the same material and read it in this line. And that some different components, for example, how we understand what I'm calling here the politics of refusal, one might get to some slightly different, but maybe complementary conclusions. I don't know if they would be necessarily in complete opposition to each other. But I think this is a bigger debate. Like your question highlights, there are different kind of theoretical landscapes that are being brought to bear on the kind of Black condition, you might say, of especially looking at questions of economic precariousness. And a place like Zandspruit is a place that is precarious in many ways, economically being one of others. So I'm aware of other scholars who are writing through that lens and whose work I find very useful to think with. One of the reasons, so I was specifically wanting to kind of also speak to the debates around worker resistance and highlight, I think, blind spots in some of that body of work that is excluding the unemployed and often the more precarious types of employment, but that I think are critical to understand the dynamics of incorporation or inclusion and exclusion within the labor market more widely. And so in a sense, some of the arguments I'm making here are a particular intervention into a set of debates. So that's, that also, I think once you see your research as can be used in two different purposes depending on the theoretical debates one's contributing to. But this question around Afro-pessimism and fatalism, it also comes back to these like kind of fundamental questions around how we understand agency. And, I think often work such as mine has often been said to kind of romanticize or overplay the agency that people have. But a lot of my work is about is the refusal of low-waged work is one side of a coin that I've been trying to understand. The other is around all the other types of economic activities that take place, which allow for on the practical side, the refusal of some of the available jobs to take place. So I've framed a lot of my work in relation to an idea of kind of making a life, or I've recently read Hugo Kirkhanam's book on riotous deathscapes, which also engages with some of the literatures and the debates you're talking about, and how do we understand modes of living, but also modes of resistance in what he calls deathscapes, which is speaking to, I think, more of the Afro-pessimist literatures. And then your question about positionality, of course, I could speak about this at great length, and it's something I've, in a wider book project, I'm having to reflect upon much more carefully and thinking about, doing research in Zandspruit for 10 years. So, of course, my positionality as a white woman, often basically a similar age to my interlocutors. You know, I began this research in my mid-20s and am now in my very late 30s. And many of Capello, Tonello, we are a similar age, and we've stayed in touch over these periods of years. And so in a sense, in the early phases of my research, and as well during my PhD research in 2015 predominantly, you could say outsider status as a woman, as a white woman, as a privileged white woman, it's a kind of double-edged sword is often how I think about it. On the one hand, this meant many of my interlocutors were curious about me. I just stood out so clearly. And this actually, I think, allowed for an openness. It's something I've reflected upon in other writing. The fact that I was often spending a lot of time in very masculine spaces that Black women who live in Zandspruit couldn't spend time, for example, in a car wash, which caused resentment amongst young women and often the girlfriends of some of my interlocutors. So my outside status sometimes actually, I think, helped the research in that it was like, who the heck are you and what are you doing here? And that curiosity allowed for openness and over time, friendships, I would say, even to develop. But on the same time, I have constantly been aware of what I often call my racial ignorance. So there's a sense of like some of the things that I've too, if I got the name right, Kumo's question, you know, what surprises did I have at the beginning of this research that have dissolved? I mean, some of the things that I didn't understand and that surprised me very early on, especially as a master's student, are things that are tied to my racial privilege and as someone that doesn't live in Zandspruit full time. If you want to ask more about that, I'm very happy to take further questions. But this is something I have continued to reflect upon, and in writing some of this research, but in new forms, these are questions I kind of constantly am going back to. What they make, what blind spots I have, where they've actually, my outside status and ignorance have allowed me to penetrate certain questions that maybe also get taken for granted. So I'll leave that answer there for now. And then, I mean, I think Kumo, what has surprised me, I mean, I think it is not a surprise anymore, but this, just like all of us, you know, what shapes our work decisions this is for me is like a universal that, you know, none of us do a job just to earn money. That, you know, some people are forced to take jobs because of that, you know, a need to put something on the table tonight. But I think all of us, in a sense, want work that is about something far bigger than just a form of material provision. But often those with fewer resources, we don't take the aspirations for more filling, more meaningful work, I think, as seriously. And I think you see this in the way in which the policy debates talk about unemployment and talk about solutions to employment in ways that reduce the whole idea of what it is to work to a material question rather than a question around, you know, what it is to have a good life, for example. So that's maybe one way to answer your question, but I could answer it in other ways. But thank you for those, both of you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hannah, for your responses. Do we still have some more questions? I think we should have some more questions for Hannah. Yes, Jacqueline, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Doc, for giving me the platform, and also thank you, Dr. Hannah, for giving us an insightful presentation. I enjoyed reading your paper. What I wanted to understand is that what is further research needed in this area? Do you feel that your paper gave enough information in this area, or there is more research that is still needed to be done? And also, what are the key findings in your research?
Great,
Okay.
thanks, Jacqueline.
I think we could take one or two more. We can open it up to everyone who might have questions. We can take one or two more questions before we give Hannah the chance to. Yes, I see Godfrey. Go ahead.
Thank you, Doc. I kept on losing my network. I don't know if someone asked my question. Thank you very much for your paper, Hannah. I enjoyed reading it. When we look at the issue of resisting low-paying jobs, as it were, as a way of maybe pushing those in power to relook at policy and maybe wages. I don't know if you agree with me. I know you spoke about this issue of maybe illegal immigrants or immigrants in general, coming through into the country in this area and maybe being prepared to take these jobs. Do you think, this then undermines this form of resistance?
Okay.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Yeah, I think we have Eddie and then Kumo. I think maybe you have another question to add on, so we can have Eddie and then Kumo.
Yeah, thank you, Doc. Thank you, Dr. Hannah, for your presentation. I have two questions. You mentioned that these people are resist oppression and through refusing work. I want to know, are there ways of resistance in which they then try to accumulate? Are there ways in which they try to accumulate in a resisting way? Then the question two is, I also want to understand the political participation of these youth. Do they have platforms? Not youth. These people that you were talking about. Do they have platforms through which they put their grievances, or how are they participating in political processes in relation to their position?
Yeah. Also, really great questions.
Okay. Kumo, you. I think you have another one, or maybe it's an odd hand.
Yes, I do have another question. It would be my final question, though.
That's fine. That's fine.
You had mentioned that your white privilege surprisingly managed to get you into spaces where you could get more information to help with your research. But I want to know, have you, during your research, did you not come across people or young men who thought that they could benefit from you because, okay, they see this white person and they believe that, okay, if I give her information, there's a possibility that she could help me find a better job?
Yeah. Okay, let me try and take those. Let me maybe start with yours, Kumo. Just to say, yes, of course. I mean, this is also a very common, even if you are not, many of my students, they also, even if they're working in their own community and are themselves Black, research does come with social demands. It's like any other relationship. I often like to emphasize this. It comes with misunderstandings, it comes with expectations, it comes with obligations. And of course, given the differences in access to resources, educational opportunities, networks, all of these things. I would say yes, especially in the early phases of my research, these were very common and not to be, I don't think they're surprising. I remember even the first few days I spending time at the pickup, the day laboring pickup point. Most people who get jobs have left by between 5 and 8 a.m. in the morning. And often I was only getting there at 8 a.m. and then would be there for some hours. And, the first few times, everyone who's waiting there on the side of the road for a job assumed, I was there because I needed someone to work, I don't know, in my home or something. But, once you build relationships with people, people kind of begin to understand who you are, why you're there. And that kind of shifts the contours of those relationships and into something more complex and more open-ended. Of course, maybe because I didn't say at the beginning, especially for my PhD, I did 10 months of research, and I lived in Cosmo City, which is the neighboring area to Zandspruit, and spent basically every day in Zandspruit for those 10 months. For most of the day, and I spent my time between a few key sites where I would spend, very large chunks of time. So one of those was this day labor pickup point. Another was a youth NGO that is run by young people in the community, which is where I also volunteered a lot of my time. Another was an internet cafe, which is, a common place where young people are writing up CVs. And then another was a car wash stand, which was basically where I learned most of what I understand about the informal economy of Zandspruit. It's from spending lots of time at this car wash site, because that was also the place where the drug trade was interconnected, the taxi industry and the local street patrollers and vigilante groups, it all kind of intersects in this one street in Zandspruit, where I knew two men that have run a car wash stand there for 10 years, or people I met at first in 2011. So just to say, yes, those are expectations that were very common in the first few weeks of doing research, but became less, not the only conversation as time developed. And sometimes there's still things I'm negotiating with people I'm in touch with, some of whom, have remained interlocutors and friends over many years. So I think that's also one of the things, is that these questions look slightly differently depending on how long, I guess, you are doing research in a particular place for. But yeah, very much I've had to negotiate these kinds of expectations and requests, and I think in many cases are kind of legitimate, but one has to negotiate these like you do any other social relationship. I would maybe answer it like that. And then I think the questions from Jacqueline, Godfrey, and Eddie, they some of them I want to link together. Eddie, maybe just your last question about political avenues for participation. I mean, like I said, my older work was on political protests in Zandspruit, and I've continued to write about, to follow. So even though I did my master's research very intensively on a string of protests around the local election in 2011, I've continued to follow the elections, the protests when they erupt in Zandspruit, and to try and understand shifts in what triggers them, what demands are being made. And I'm hoping something will actually come out that articulates some of this. I think there is a shift in the sense that I think 12 years ago, I think many Zandspruit residents thought that the government would actually do more than it's done. There was still some hope, some optimism, some aspiration that, houses would be built, bulk sanitation would actually be laid underground, whereas very much now, I think the large majority of residents have given up on the state, And you see this in the fact that 12 years ago, there was very, very few concrete buildings that had been built. People were very nervous about investing their money in, building concrete rooms to rent, for example, because, I think people thought they might legitimately get demolished to build RDP houses. Whereas now I think there's very much a sense that the state is unlikely to develop the area. And so there's all sorts of forms of what I've called DIY urbanism, and there's also lots of literature on that. And so on the one hand, there's a kind of, you could call again a kind of fatalism about the absence of the state, the sense that the state has kind of abandoned this area and this community, even though Cyril Ramaphosa had a rally, was present in Ward 114 in Cosmos City on the weekend. So, it's still an area that is an important place in the ANC remaining dominant in that region of Gauteng. But I think, so on the one hand, there's a sense that the state has kind of abandoned Zandspruit and abandoned the majority of people in Zandspruit, is a dominant perception I have. But at the same time, I would say the avenue for political protest and demands is in a sense not on the employer, it's on the state. So there is still, when protests do erupt, they are increasingly less about making demands for delivery, and much more about resisting evictions, resisting all the Izinyoka connections being cut. So I think basically you've seen people take the delivery of services into their own hands and are now defending those in the absence of the state. And so the local community is the site of protests or the site of resistance, rather than employers or the workplace. So that's how I'd answer that question. And then I really like how you phrased your first question around, are there forms of resistance through accumulation? And absolutely, yes. Like I said, I think so. This is how I think about it. So for example, you can't really understand and I couldn't touch upon this in this paper, but I have written this elsewhere, and I'm trying to finalize a book project that brings all of these different threads together. But there's, in the one section of this paper, I think I talk about uneven choice, and I talk about, not everyone can refuse a job. So it's definitely a phenomenon which I think is more common amongst men rather than women, and South Africans rather than non-South Africans. And that's very specific. So I don't think this is a generalized phenomenon. I think it's actually particular to particular groups of individuals, and in this case, Black young South African men. I think the ability or the desire to refuse a job is also not something that's the same if you're 18, 28, 38, or 58. I think there's a particularity to refusing low-wage work. But where I do think you see what you called resistance through accumulation is through for example, the informal property market. And so, like I said at the beginning, you can only refuse a low-wage job if you have some other means of income. And this is why I think one does need to, so it wasn't the focus of this paper, but it is a key component of understanding these things, that I think the refusal of low-wage jobs by some South African young men is very much tied to their accumulation of resources in other areas. One particular area is in, I think, how the informal property market works in Zandspruit. And if you are a recent migrant, it doesn't matter if you come from Zimbabwe or you come from the Eastern Cape. If you've never lived in Zandspruit and you arrive there today wanting to find a shack to live in and to get a job in the surrounding areas, like, you are by definition a tenant, and therefore your rent is going into the hands of predominantly insiders who've lived in Zandspruit for a long time. So absolutely, the dynamics of incorporation in the formal labor markets are very much tied to the dynamics and the money flows within the local economy. And this is probably the thing I'm most interested in working on, And so that speaks to, well, both Godfrey, your question around where do immigrants fit into this picture? And I think and Jacqueline's question was, what areas of future research? So one, I think my suspicion is, I did a little bit of research with Black South African women and immigrants, but I never made it the absolute focus of my PhD research. But I think both women and immigrants do not have the same capacity to refuse work. I think understanding the ways in which the labor market is segmented and differentiated, not just by the type of jobs, but by who does those jobs, is a really, really interesting and a really important area of future research. And I think we do need to think about the informal economy and the formal economy as much more part of one economy rather than separate. That I think if you want to understand who can refuse a job in Zandspruit, you have to understand that these are normally people who have lived in Zandspruit a long time, don't pay rent, have access to rental income from others who are often doing the very types of jobs that young men don't want to. So these kind of economies are interconnected, and that's something I've been writing about and something I think is a really interesting area of future research, and would encourage more people to be working on the intersections of these economies as money circulates within a particular space. So I hope that answers, but these are very much questions and research that's ongoing for me and things I'm really interested in. So if anyone also wants to write to me on these particular questions, I'm very happy to keep talking on them. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Hannah. I think maybe I'll just take one. Nelukalo, you had your hand up. Maybe if you can just throw in a quick question. I know we've eaten into Hannah's time there. We're supposed to finish at 3, but Nelukalo, please go ahead and throw in your question. Nelukalo, are you still there? Do you still want to ask the question, or maybe it was answered in response to other questions?
My question was answered while she was answering other questions, but all I can say is that it was a good paper, because my question what I wanted to ask was that what are the recommendations that she can make based on the findings that she has based on this research paper, but I think she already did answer that.
Okay. No, thank you very much. So maybe that explains why you lowered your hand. But I didn't want to feel like you were excluded. Yeah, I don't know, Hannah, do you want to respond to that? I think she said you addressed that in answering the other questions.
I think it's fine.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Hannah, for making time and agreeing, to share your thoughts and your work with us. I think we really benefited from that and learned a lot. And this is really, I think, empowering some of our students who are actively asking questions and appreciating the work that you are doing. So we really appreciate that, and here and there we'll be coming back to bother you again. So I really appreciate your assistance with this, Hannah.
No problem. No, it's an honor. So thanks very much for inviting me, and just to say to all of you, especially students, just good luck with your masters. I hope it's a really good experience of doing research, and maybe see some of you at seminars or conferences in the future. So come and say hello if you see me somewhere. Okay, thanks.
All right, thanks a lot, Hannah, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks everyone for attending our 5th Sociology Tuesday postgraduate seminar. And we hope that you'll be able to join us again next week. We are going to have another presentation. Like I always highlight that we do this on every Tuesday between 2 and 3. Of course, sometimes we eat into a few minutes of your time, but we'll try to be on time and finish within the stipulated time. So I think for all the other guys who have joined us for this seminar, you can enjoy the rest of your day. And then I think the honor students, we can move to the our seminar link, and then we leave this one. We join the seminar link. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.